On the matter of Darwin and his, not theology, his philosophy. Consider the following oft-repeated quote from Sir Julian Huxley, who, until his recent death, was perhaps the world's leading spokesman for evolution. Darwin pointed out that no supernatural designer was needed, since natural selection could account for any known form of life. There was no room for a supernatural agency in its evolution. We can dismiss entirely all ideas of a supernatural overriding mind being responsible for the evolutionary process. Well, then who put it there in the first place? It kind of begs the question, right? Now, God could have done that, being supernatural, but there's nothing reflected anywhere in scientific, so-called scientific observational world that would indicate that. Because the idea of natural selection doesn't work. Scientifically observed, philosophically invented, yeah. On the other hand, Scripture in many places and in many ways identifies God as creator and claims that his creation was an act of forethought, of planning, of design. Yeah, see now if there was some matter of natural selection, who put that in force? If God did it, but it doesn't show evidence that it actually works. So, who created that? So, Darwin just conflicts with his own points of view everywhere and everything that he says. And so, Scripture in many places and in many ways identifies God as creator and claims that his creation was an act of forethought, of planning, of design. Supernatural processes were used to accomplish this design, not just natural processes. These two concepts, supernatural design versus natural processes operating by chance, represent the two views of origins and are opposite. Matter of fact, just a while back, they invented the idea because they couldn't explain certain things. They called it the God particle, the Big Bang Theory thing. Well, you take out supernatural design, you can't put it back in. No, apparently they did. They cannot both be true. Nobel Prize-winning zoologist Jacques Monod said it this way: it necessarily follows that chance alone is at the very source of every innovation. Pure chance, absolutely free but blind, at the very root of the stupendous edifice of evolution. Well, evolution is the God then. But who created evolution? A whole bunch of people writing about it, and they conflict with one another almost all the time. The recent edition of the authoritative Encyclopedia Britannica informs us that Darwin did two things. He showed that evolution was a fact, contradicting literal interpretations of scriptural legends of creation, and that its cause, natural selection, was automatic with no room for divine guidance or design. Of course, when it goes awry, then what do? When the rock strata don't match up with your natural selection, and including the fossils that are contained therein, what do? You write another textbook. Many Christians believe in evolution, but they must come to realize that the evolutionary way of thinking is a logical necessity if, and only if, there has been no supernatural input in nature. Furthermore, if evolution is true, the entire Christian faith is a sham. Dr. William Provine, professor of history and biology at Cornell University and author of many anti-creation articles, wrote recently that Darwin recognized, quote, if natural selection explained adaptations and evolution by descent were true, then the argument from design was dead, and all that went with it, namely, the existence of a personal God, free will, life after death, immutable, unchangeable moral laws, and ultimate meaning of life in life. But evolution is not a fact. Put that in quotes and caps. Evolution is not even in a category of things that could ever be a scientific fact. It is a worldview about the past, an historical reconstruction. It is a way to interpret scientific data such as rocks, fossils, and complex living systems which exist in the present. It is a potential answer to the question, what happened in the unobserved past to make the present get to be this way? As we have seen, this answer encompasses far more than merely a scientific proposal. As currently understood by leading evolutionists, it embraces strict naturalism, an anti-God philosophy, and results in the denial of the major doctrines of Scripture. And the interesting thing about that is, the things that they deny in Scripture relative to creation actually prove themselves out to be scientific, far greater than evolution ever did. Darwin, in his writings, letters, and memoirs, promoted natural selection as a means by which the incredible design obvious in every living system could be derived through purely mechanistic, naturalistic processes. He devoted great energy to refuting the writings of William Paley, in which Paley reasoned that one can infer from the functional complexity of a system that intelligence was necessary in its formation, especially if you can't find anything around that's intelligent enough to have created it in the first place. Something less complex can't turn around and add to its own complexity to form something more complex, just as a complex watch necessarily implies a watchmaker. So living systems, much more complex than a watch, demand that a creator was involved in their origin. You don't have to read the Bible, although it might be a good idea to get a hint of it. Just look at the design of the human body, or less complex mammals, or other life forms. Just the simplest, most simple life forms. A single-celled living being, either plant or animal. How does it work its filter system, where it takes certain things in and certain things out? It's so complex. His position was eminently logical, but necessarily implied a creator God. And this helps explain why Darwin and his modern disciples combat the concept of design with such vigor. If such a creator exists, he has the authority to set the rules for his creation and the authority to set the rules for breaking his rules. Accountability for our own actions to a holy creator God is not necessarily easily accepted by the natural man. Jesus told Nicodemus, and this is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. John 3:19. Jesus not only proclaimed messages like this, but he performed deeds that were supernatural. And it's attested to in and out of Scripture. If no supernatural agency has been at work throughout history, then creation is dead. But if evolutionists even allow a spark of supernatural design in history, then evolution is dead, for evolution necessarily relies on solely natural processes. But design in living things is obvious. Even the single-celled organism is complex beyond the ability of scientists to understand, let alone duplicate. All of life is governed by the marvelously complex genetic code, which contains not only design and order, but what is equivalent to written information. This DNA code must not only be written correctly, but the rest of the cell must be able to read it and follow its instructions. If the cell is to metabolize its food, carry out the myriad of enzyme reactions, and especially to reproduce, this code had to be present at the origin of life. How could it have written itself? How could the various organelles, parts of the cell, learn how to read and obey it? It's unbelievable. Carl Sagan, the modern-day evolutionary spokesman, has admitted the information content of a single cell has been established at around 1012 bits, comparable to about 100 million pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Wow! Wonder if the cell had a pen or a typewriter. And yet he believes the code wrote itself by purely random natural processes as non-living chemicals sprang to life. Is this view really credible? Is it really scientific to ascribe to natural processes functions and products which clearly are the result of intelligent design? The Bible tells us that even the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. I think the key is accountability. Mankind wants to do what he wants to do, so he'll talk his way around anything. Except people who have some concept of logic, language, context, and logic, can out-argue that without hardly even trying. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Psalm 19, 1-3. The heavens declare the glory of God. So much the more the complexity of man and animals. The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. A favorite example of obvious design has always been the human eye with its functioning parts, the lens, cornea, iris, etc. The controlling muscles, the sensitive rods and cones which translates light energy into chemical signals, the optic nerve which speeds these signals to a decoding center in the brain, and on and on. The eye was unquestionably designed by an incredibly intelligent designer who had a complete grasp of optical physics. Know anybody who has an optical physics mastery other than humans? Darwin was frustrated by the eye's complexity, even though he knew only a fraction of what scientists have now discovered about the eye. In his book, Origin of Species, he included a section entitled Organs of Extreme Perfection and Complication. In which he declared to suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. Yet in the several pages he discussed how he thought it might have happened. One may wonder why Darwin was forced to adopt and defend what he admitted was an absurd conclusion. His reasoning is made plain in the following quote. Keep in mind that Darwin was raised in a nominally religious home, but whose extended family had a well-established anti-Christian perspective. Darwin himself studied for the ministry, as was common in those days for individuals of a scholarly bent. So he just did that in order to go to school, I guess, but eventually rejected the Christian faith. In May 22, 1860, letter to Professor Asa Gray of Harvard, propagator of evolution on the American continent, Darwin wrote, evidently to answer Gray's advocacy of theistic evolution. And that is defined as God created the universe and sat back and let it evolve. Darwin wrote, I had no intention to write atheistically, but I own that I cannot see as plainly as others do, and as I should wish to do, evidence of design and beneficence, or goodness, on all sides of us. There seems to be too much misery. There seems to me to be too much misery in the world. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the ichneumonidae parasites with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that a cat should play with mice. Not believing this, I see no necessity in the belief that the eye was expressly designed, parenthesis added. Notice that Darwin was not looking at the eye and concluding an evolutionary origin. He looked at the pain, the suffering, the misery, and the death in the world, and concluded that there must not be a God as revealed in the Bible if there was such a God. He wouldn't have created the world as we encounter it, because if he read the Bible properly, the answers are right there. Not interested. What Darwin missed is that God did create a perfect world without suffering, misery, and death everywhere. Genesis 1:1.